Too often, we view our lives as individual rather than intimately connected to others. We tell stories that emphasize our differences and don't reveal the whole truth, just what shows us in the best light. Even when we admit wrongdoing, most apologies require little from us. No radical change in identity or deep exploration of what led to our misdeed. We apologize and say the right thing, then return to business as usual with no guarantee we won't do it again. Except maybe next time we won't get caught. History follows this self-serving pattern. Its editors insist you don't know how it was or you had to be there, then claim that there were no witnesses to challenge their account. This is particularly effective when certain people are not considered full humans or trusted to know their own truths. They are silenced, rejected, marginalized, whatever it takes to omit their stories from public record. This trains us not to hear who we don't want to be: the weak, the vulnerable, the voiceless, victims. We all practice disidentification. In fact, we are ironically united in defining who we are by who or what we are not. Our stories emphasize these binaries instead of our capacity to become what we most repudiate and our commonalities. Believing ourselves so entirely one thing makes it difficult to accept when we behave outside of our expected self-determined categories. But the way we treat one another warrants deeper examination, even if it defies expectation. And when we commit harm, that story is worth examining, no matter the damage to our internalized narratives. I learned this story studying history and teaching history, but confronting my own past viscerally brought home its significance. When I started college, I was 16, precocious and eager to experience life away from parental oversight. This meant, among other things, having guilt-free sexual liaisons, and my sheltered, self-governing college provided an ideal setting for this pursuit. But my models of sexual autonomy were steeped in patriarchal entitlement. Love them and leave them and never look back, and score as much action as possible. This story played on all around me, and I was often on the receiving end. Early on, I befriended Tina, who believed, like me, in our right to experiment and the implied consent of every straight male to willingly comply with our demands. We made a list of our intended conquests and illustrated it like a pinup calendar. The hot senior in back-to-school September perched rakishly on a stack of books. A cocky singer graced December, dressed as a scantily clad holiday elf. Tina and I didn't dwell on our own experiences of being objectified. We brazenly reclaimed power that had been taken from us and missed how flipping the script maintained a harmful dynamic. Tina figured this out before I did and discarded our calendar project, while I spent the first years of college justifying my right as a woman to behave like a woman-hating man. I even asked my gender and women's studies professor what the feminist equivalent of misogyny was. She taught me the term misandry, but rightfully questioned my premise. It's not feminist to seek division or to search for someone to hate. Hatred and fear breed entitlement and deny human equality. When we believe ourselves better or more deserving than anyone else, we put our preferences, needs, and desires before theirs without pausing to examine the narrative that established our superiority. Believing our stories that tell us of our perfection and our inability to behave in this other way traps us. We're trapped into believing a singular story, or that we are only our story. We insist on our truths and tell more stories to confirm it. And this becomes what our listeners remember. In fact, what you'll recall of my talk today is the story at its center. A few years ago, one of my former college lovers informed me that our final encounter had not been consensual. The revelation stunned me and called into question many stories I believed about myself. I hazily remembered the night as a drunken encounter, no different from many before, except that only I was inebriated and that he knocked the wind out of me when it was over. At the time, this seemed an inappropriate response to my interrupting his homework with the offer of what every guy wants. That false narrative erased my friend and replaced him with an object for use as I saw fit. 23 years later, he bravely recounted his memory of that night, leaving me, a feminist professor and scholar of sexual assault, to reckon with what I had done. I could have wallowed in regret and shame for what I had done to my friend and possibly many others. I could have kept this story silent. But silence fuels systems that reward and protect abuse, just like false and self-serving narratives. Still, I could have stuck with my story that having carefree sex freed me from patriarchy and flipped the tables on misogyny. But liberation at somebody else's expense is not freedom. And being victimized doesn't mean you can't also commit harm. Our singular stories deny multiplicity and prevent us from sharing experiences that shame us. We further silence victims by denying their truth when it doesn't fit our story. We ask, how could this happen to you? You're too smart, too strong, too outspoken. We turn on ourselves with the same questions. How could I do this or let it happen to me? We are trapped by believing only one story, or that we are only our story. And I get it. It's scary to publicly say these things, to admit that I assaulted someone or that I was assaulted. Fear of being permanently branded helps us keep our stories quiet and prevents us from sharing what has happened. But when we speak about these stories, we give power to all of the elements. We let the stories become our reality. Being able to recognize that I could be both victim and perpetrator of sexual assaults allowed me to hold these stories simultaneously and to speak my truth about them. I want to be clear, I'm not an apologist for assault under any circumstances. Toxic masculinity and its patriarchal handmaidens are responsible for much of what is wrong in the world, aided by the very narratives that I'm addressing. I am sharing this story in part because I want to process my outrage at the continued prevalence of sexual assault and our failure of our institutions to express clear information about consent and respect. Any touch without permission amounts to violation, and I live in a body that is frequently seen as accessible, whereas others clearly do not. Our culture promotes this distinction beginning at birth. For example, while in college, I watched a professor's young son, the kind that people call tow-headed, run around screaming and knocking books out of students' arms all over the grass. His babysitter explained he has no home training. But I wondered what indeed he was taught about how to respect other people's bodies and what kind of person he'd grow up to become. The stories we're told and retell about ourselves can permit the worst behavior and justify replicating it, even when we have been its recipients. Being able to acknowledge my experiences on both the victim and perpetrator end led me to develop a curriculum to try to curtail similar behavior. I started with the limits of apology, which, done poorly, don't guarantee change. Feeling sorry or ashamed with no action attached can lead to stultifying paralysis. The American struggle to acknowledge, let alone address, centuries of abuse demonstrates the failure of this approach. Denial likewise traps us in a web of stereotypes about people we believe to be different and less than ourselves. We deny their right to have what we have, or insist, I'm not like that, I could never do that. Or we believe if I've been hurt, I can't also be a hurter. But these singular stories don't allow for all of the multiple facets. The singular stories are trapping us. So this led me to a practice I call REDE, an acronym for Radical Empathy Disrupts Entitlement. It's a mouthful, so let's work through it slowly, beginning with entitlement. Most of us don't move through the world believing that we are entitled, but we act in so many ways as if it owes us something. We've internalized stories that expect us to be treated in a certain way. We believe that our education, our social status, or our zip code entitle us to certain privileges. The effects may be relatively innocuous, like expecting to be called doctor because of my PhD, or drawing pictures of boys that I find attractive. Or they may lead to more egregious results, like exploiting people's cultures or bodies in ways we would never elect for ourselves. When we ignore the stories that justify this behavior, we facilitate abusive entitlement. Now, my 17-year-old self didn't intentionally hurt anyone, but I was discouraged from examining the trauma of my own background and how it might reappear in the ways that I treated others. Interrupting this cycle requires more than empathy, which can maintain a self-other binary, whereas radical empathy destroys the illusion of otherness. Radical empathy, by deconstructing our divisive stories, can, like the acronym suggests, ready us to make more compassionate choices, both for ourselves and the people we affect. This begins by becoming aware of how our actions impact others, even those we do not intend, and affects both our interpersonal relations as well as social systems. On a systemic level, listening for silences and voices left out of public record begins with awareness of how we factor into that same record. Does it center our experiences at the expense of someone else's? Are we typically heard more often, and have we bought into this as business as usual? By interrupting those patterns, REDE promotes the challenge of them and asks us to think about those divisions. Ready to practice? All right, let's start by asking some questions about your core identity. Who am I, and how do I know? How do I define myself? By who or what I am not? For instance, political party, religion, race, gender. What was I taught about how to behave because of my identity? Why do I continue this behavior? How do I and people like me occupy space? Your responses may not soothe you, and frankly, they're not meant to. The disruption at the center of REDE is intended to interrupt the cycles of habit that we've become accustomed to. It doesn't destroy entitlement overnight, but rather restructures our ability to see beyond separation and unjustified assumptions about how we affect our surroundings and the people within them. REDE is not a quick fix of past mistakes. It is a proactive approach to critical thinking and self-analysis, skills that prepare us to critically challenge the validity of stories we take for granted. Like any practice or regimen, it requires repetition for the disruption to stick. This is fundamental life work, transformed over time into habit. Allowing ourselves and others to be more than one story means we can alter our future. We can move from perpetrator to victim or to something else. And when we do so, our freedom and power to change becomes limitless. REDE reminds us to study our narratives, listen, and trust. When someone tells you you violated them, believe it, whether or not it fits your story. Thank you.